We're going to talk about opioids. This is very important. The opioid epidemic is real. It's a scourge to our country. It was started because of a lot of different things, including poorly thought out federal policy, pharmaceutical companies marketing aggressively. But it was also started because of a cultural change. And I was in training when this happened. So 20 years ago, there was this shift in the medical thinking about how to handle these drugs. And the reason that we have an opioid epidemic is because there was a little bit of research done, and people said, oh, we don't think these are addictive, and they're helping people with pain. And then other folks would say, well, wait a minute, now there's not a lot of research done on this. We need to be careful. And the other side would say, but people are suffering. They're suffering. Don't you have a heart? Don't you have compassion? You're just a traditionalist. You're just being paternalistic. And they push these drugs out with this scanty research, with very little accountability. Now here we are 15, 20 years later, and it is a scourge that is destroying our country.
Yes.
Tons of pain, problems and suffering on the back end of this. So what's eerie to me is, having been in training while all this was going on and now being a part of this marijuana debate, is the same sort of reasons, the same justifications are being used for marijuana that were used for opioids all those years ago, all these narcotics. You say, well, wait a minute, the research doesn't show this, we need to be careful. And they say, but people are suffering. This will help them. You're just being a traditionalist. You're being paternalistic. You're lacking in compassion. It's the same sort of arguments. And my argument to them is this, is that I've lived through this once, and I've seen the damage. And I'm not going to be silent on this, because I know what can happen on the back end. In a well-intentioned push to help people who are suffering, if we do this irresponsibly, we're going to get more suffering on the back end if we do this wrong. Next slide. Okay, so what about marijuana safety? Is it really safe? Is it just another herb, like something you sprinkle on your salad or whatever? Is it something that people can participate in and not have any dire consequences? Well, I would say no. And this is a mnemonic that came from, this is Clinical Neuroscience, Innovations in Clinical Neuroscience Medical Journal. There's 5 areas that marijuana affects: dependence, driving, underachievement, mental illness, and bad to worse. Next slide. So the first thing, dependence. The pro-marijuana crowd, if you say that marijuana is addictive or that it leads to other things, they go bonkers on this, bonkers. I've been in a couple of these debates, and it's just this physical reaction from the pro-marijuana crowd. It doesn't do that, doesn't do that. Yes, it does. And just, if you look at the medical research, it's very clear. Marijuana, 1 in 6 kids, so people under the age of 25, if they use, 1 in 6 of them will become dependent on marijuana. 25 to 50% of daily users become dependent on marijuana, regardless of their age. This is right out of a journal called Addictive Behaviors. Adolescent onset cannabis, so these are kids under the age of 25, if they're using, those users were an estimated 2 to 4 times more likely to experience clinical features of dependence within 2 years. Next slide. And one of the things that's most concerning, and this has been replicated in the medical research over and over and over again, as the perception of risk and disapproval of any drug, but particularly marijuana, as the perception of risk and the perception of disapproval starts to drop, use goes up. And the reason that's important is, remember, there's a national narrative telling people this is safe, this is medicine, it's just an herb, it's natural, everything's fine. The perception of risk with marijuana is dropping. The perception of disapproval is dropping. And so use is on the rise, and that's a big problem. Next slide. Regarding vehicle crashes, my wife is not a medical person. I started telling her some of this, and she, of course, went to her hairdresser, started telling her hairdresser about this. I've become convinced if you want to know what's going on in any community, you talk to the bartenders and the hairdressers. They know everything. Everyone talks to those 2 groups of people. My wife talked to the hairdresser and said, my husband, he's involved in this, and I'm learning all this stuff about marijuana. And the hairdresser said, oh my goodness. At another salon where I used to work, the women there would smoke marijuana before they drove home because they said it helped them focus. So we can put people in simulators, and 2 puffs of the high THC joints that are available now, standard, 2 puffs, that we can show that people start making errors in their driving in a simulator. So marijuana use by drivers is associated with significantly increased crash risk, and also in other studies, fatal crash risk. And that's from Epidemiologic Reviews in 2012. Next slide. This is one of the most important things. If you're talking about what marijuana does is dangerous, remember this slide. So what they've shown, and it's been replicated in multiple studies and shown in these longitudinal studies, they test kids at the age of 13 before they start using marijuana. They've gone back years later at the age of 38 when they're adults. And the kids who participated in marijuana never regain the cognitive ability, the brain function that they had when they were 13. And if they've continued into adulthood smoking, their brain function, their cognitive testing ability has dropped even further. This quote here, cessation of cannabis or cessation of marijuana use did not fully restore the neuropsychological functioning among adolescent onset cannabis users. What that means is this: you use marijuana when you're young and you stop, you're never going back to where the person you were. You've lost it. And that's never discussed in the lay press. And people are marketing this again as safe and effective for all this stuff. This is a big problem, and I think in 10 or 15 years it's going to be very commonly discussed. Next slide. Psychiatric effects. Using marijuana causes memory impairment that lasts over 7 days after last use. Acute psychosis with a dose effect, which means the higher the dose, the more you're using, the more likely you are to have psychotic features. There are people in Colorado, there are cases of people ingesting marijuana, drinking a little bit of alcohol, losing their minds, assaulting their family, running out in traffic. A young man just a few weeks ago jumped off the top of a building. So marijuana doesn't cause overdoses. That doesn't mean it's safe. All right? Cigarettes don't cause overdoses. We don't call them safe. So if you're looking just at overdoses, you're taking a too narrow view of these drugs. You need to broaden your view. This causes problems. Depression, anxiety, underlying schizophrenia. If you have a family history of that, then you are upping your risk that it's going to become full-blown. Next slide.